One. Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Microsoft Data and AI South Florida. We are here today for another great presentation. And before we start, please take a minute and remember to subscribe to the channel and click the bell so you're reminded every time there is a new video coming in, as well as like our videos. We really appreciate that. Keep us in tune and knowing if you like the video, what changes we can make and how can we make it better. So as we start in here, please just let me know, drop a comment, let me know that you are able, on the chat window, that you are able to hear me as well. Thank you. All right. So what do we have here today? We are very, very fortunate to have here with us. And let me transition here so we all can see our guests today. We have Sander and Kevin. They're going to be presenting Azure DevOps Duet. They are experts in the field and bringing you knowledge from all the way from the Netherlands, where they reside. So, hello Kevin and hello Sander. How are you all doing?
Yeah, good, thanks.
Very well, thank you.
All right. Hey, thank you very much for taking the time from your busy schedule to be here with us presenting Azure DevOps Duet. We really appreciate, and you are all part of our international series presentation where we have been going to different continents around the world and bringing those experts on different types of technology that are data platform related and presenting to our members. All right. So tell me a little bit about the presentation. I know that you are going to cover it in more details in just a minute, but can you give us at least some basic details there?
Do you want to go for it, Sander?
You go ahead.
Okay, well, basically this session is about how to use Azure DevOps for SQL Server deployments. In addition to that, there's also a theme to the session as well today, which is where a development team and an operations team have to merge together effectively to start using Azure DevOps to do them as well. That's the session in a small summary for you.
All right. Great. So without further ado, let's get started. Y'all guys ready?
Yes, we are.
All right, folks. Everybody can see it. I don't see anybody. No problem with sound. I believe everybody can hear it. Great. So it's all you now, gentlemen.
Okay, well, thank you very much. I was just about to check on the YouTube. There's a slight delay. Hopefully everybody can see our initial slide here. So, like you said earlier, welcome to today's session, Azure DevOps Duet, which is a tale about how a development team and an operations team have to bond together to start using Azure DevOps for SQL Server deployments.
So for the next 60 minutes, we'll be talking about Azure DevOps, which allows you to do the full application management lifecycle, from creating a work item all the way to its release. We'll be discussing cloud and on-premise versions of Azure DevOps, as well as its features, including the source control, the boards, pipelines, artifacts, and test plans. And at the end of this session, you will have a basic understanding of the main features of Azure DevOps and how it can be used with SQL Server.
So, as I mentioned earlier, in this session, one of us is from the SQL development team and the other is from the SQL operations team. Our manager has kindly decided that we will all merge into one DevOps team so that we're all one big happy family.
In reality, though, this should be a real gradual process. However, since this is only a 60-minute session, we've taken it upon ourselves to speed up this process. In addition, our manager has decided that the development team lead will be the Scrum Master and the Operations team lead will be the product owner.
Now, for those of you who don't know, a product owner is responsible for translating the business needs into workable backlog items for Scrum sprints. However, it can be used with other frameworks as well. Of course, that also means that they have to speak to various stakeholders within the business at different levels. In addition to that, they are ultimately responsible for prioritizing the work that the team does as part of their sprints, even though they may get input from other stakeholders about what the priorities are.
So a Scrum Master's role is to empower the team to do those backlog items by encouraging how they work and removing any impediments if they occur.
So, before we go any further, Sander, let's introduce ourselves.
Yes, shall we? So I'm Sander. I'm a SQL Server DBA living in the Netherlands. I work for Waypoint Analytical, which is a company based in the United States. They do large-scale water, soil, and plant sampling for one thing they do for big farms and analyze all the soil samples, all those kind of things. Really interesting field. I'm a cloud and data center MVP, recently renewed, which I'm really proud of. I'm a major contributor to the DBA Tools project. You can follow me on Twitter. I have a blog which I try to write as much as I can, but due to other projects, it's it as a backlog item. If you have any questions after this session, you can send me an email. I will try to reply as fast as I can. And all the demos that will be showing today will be available on my GitHub page under the presentations. Just look up this session and you will find the demos out there. If you can teach them, change them, and whatever you want to do with them. And if you have any questions, contact me. And now we're going to Kevin, who has a slightly more complicated bio.
Thanks for that, Sander. Well, anyway, my name's Kevin Chant. I'm a senior database architect living in the Netherlands. However, as some of you may be able to tell from the accent, I'm originally from the southwest of the UK. However, I live in the Netherlands due to the fact my wife is Dutch. So basically, I'm an Englishman living in the Netherlands, working for a French-based company because he met a woman in Australia. Now, whenever I say this out loud, I realise why Sander thinks this is complicated. In addition to that, I've got over 23 years experience working in IT, and over that time I've worked in various sectors, including the banking, oil and the health insurance industries. In fact, I've supported companies that are in the top 10 of the Fortune 500 list. Now, I've worked with SQL Server in all versions of SQL Server, I should say, in one form or another. And in addition to that, I have various certifications, including both the old and the new style MCSE. And more recently, I became a Microsoft certified DevOps engineer expert, which is fairly relevant for today's session. Plus, I'm also a Microsoft certified trainer. And like Sander, I do a lot of community work, as well as speaking at events and user groups like this, for example. And I'm also one of the organizers for the Data Weekender conference. Now, as you can see at the bottom of my bio there, I'm also on social media. I'm on Twitter. My LinkedIn has got a user-friendly URL of Kevin-Chant. I have my own blog, and my email address is available upon request. Anyway, the first thing to discuss is whether to use Azure DevOps Cloud Service or Azure DevOps Server. For those of you who aren't aware of the difference, Azure DevOps Server is the new name for TFS, which is the application you install on premises to do your application lifecycle management. And what I mean by that is actually building code and deploying it across your estate. Now, it's now been rebranded to look and feel just like the cloud-based Azure DevOps service. Personally, I'd like to use Azure DevOps Server so that we can handle its security better on premises. Plus, it means we get to keep the backend databases for Azure DevOps servers. So we'll be able to get some reporting capabilities that aren't available in the Azure DevOps Cloud Service. However, the downside of doing that is that we'd have to build one or more servers with Azure DevOps Server installed for business continuity reasons. Plus, we may have to wait a while for new features to be installed on our servers locally because of the cloud first strategy. In addition to that, we'd also have to maintain and patch whichever servers we deployed.
Hey, but if you use the Azure DevOps service in the cloud instead, you wouldn't have to patch maintain anything, as all of that is maintained by Microsoft behind the scenes. Plus, it's easier to install extensions from the marketplace.
That's true, and we can still secure it in Azure. Besides, whichever we use, we still have to consider security and compliance anyway to keep our auditors happy. Luckily, Azure DevOps is fairly well structured and easy to manage.
So the main point we want you to take away from this section is that if you install Azure DevOps Server, you have to patch and maintain all your servers, whereas the cloud-based service, it's all done behind the scenes for you.
So, as you can see here, Azure DevOps has its own hierarchy. At the top, you have a logo which represents your Azure DevOps service, where your account actually has access to one or more organizations, which you can see on the left-hand side here in Azure DevOps. Now, these organizations can be the company that you work for, or just a department. In addition to that, they can also be accounts that you've created yourself for personal use, like the two organizations you can see here on the screen. Now, each organization has one or more projects within them, and each project can have one or more teams inside them, which we will show you shortly. If you look inside the project, for example, this one here we created called Florida, you will see all the Azure DevOps features that Sander mentioned at the start of the session. Plus, if you have the right permissions, you can actually change things at either the organization or project level. For example, if you look at project settings, there are various things that you can change within the project, of course, depending on the permissions you have. For example, if I click on Teams, you can manage teams within Azure DevOps, and these are obviously where you logically group teams to do things. So for example, if I click on the Florida team, you can see that me and Sandra are on the side there. I can add and remove team members. And these are members of teams that you use within your boards. In addition to that, you can also set finer permissions for team members as well. And not only that, you can actually create separate groups as well to fine-tune the permissions even further. So if I scroll down and use the Florida team again for an example, you can see I can do various things with the permissions here. Now, in addition to doing that, there's other things I can do in project settings as well. One of the more popular things to do is actually create service hooks. And what you do here, you create hooks into other applications that are available online. So example here, if I click on service hooks and then select subscription, you'll see there's a whole host of other services that I can create service hooks into, like Jenkins and Microsoft Teams. In fact, I've used a Microsoft Teams service hook in the past myself. So whenever somebody raises a pull request, they can actually Azure DevOps can actually send that request straight down to a particular channel in Microsoft Teams view, so they can be acted on quickly. Another very powerful setting that you can manage as well is coordinating parallel jobs. And that is the number of jobs you can run at the same time for a particular task in Azure DevOps. And that's based on the use of something called agents, which we'll also cover later on in today's session.
So now you're talking. Remember, there are other things we can configure as well. For example, we can set the boards to be using Scrum, which we need within our organization. And the main point we want you to take away from this section is how Azure DevOps is structured with all its features. Anyway, now we've covered the main admin stuff. Let's go into version control options within Azure Repos feature in Azure DevOps.
Do you mean like source safe?
No, not exactly source safe. Source safe is a bit outdated. We will be using something called Git.
Well, that will only be for your development work though, right? Because it sounds like version control would be complicated for the ops folks to learn.
Well, actually, I think you will see that when the ops teams start using version control, they start to perform better. At my company, we've started to put all our code in our source control systems as much as we can, which we use throughout the IT department.
Well, I'm always going for performing better, Sander, so please tell me more.
Well, like I said, Azure DevOps supports various version control systems. It supports Git and TFVC, Team Foundation Version Control. Because we have a distributed version control system, we would like to use that. Git would be better for us.
Okay, so what about branching strategies? Because I hear they're pretty important.
Yeah, well, there are various we can use. The most popular ones are Git Flow and GitHub Flow.
Well, what's the difference between those two? Because they sound pretty similar to me.
The major difference between the two is that with the Git Flow, you don't directly merge into the main branch unless it's a hotfix. So you have a development branch before the main branch. With the GitHub workflow, there's no development branch, and there are only feature branches and the main branch. And each feature gets merged into the main branch after it gets successfully tested. And us devs have been using source control for many years. So if we do things like pair programming between dev and ops members, they can probably get used to working like this.
Pair programming?
No, pair programming. So this is where two people literally write the same code together. And I know with COVID-19 that may be a bit of a problem because you literally sit next to each other working on the same code. And research has shown it usually takes a bit longer to do. However, it means you end up with more stable code and people learn new coding practices faster from more experienced programmers.
Wouldn't that mean there's a lot of overhead involved with that practice?
Yeah, you would think that. And you would also be correct. There's about a 15% overhead involved. But that overhead is largely compensated with the increased quality of code, which means less bug fixes. And everybody knows bug fixes take a lot of time. Of course, there are other methods you can use, like code reviews. And at the end of the day, we would just have to experiment which works best for us.
Okay, so what's to stop somebody coding their own release and pushing it straight to the main branch?
I'm glad you asked. So it looks like Azure DevOps has branching policies you can use. One of which is that two people have to approve updates to the main branch.
Well, that sounds good. I think we need to do that to be SOX compliant anyway, since we deal with financial data. If I'm to understand you correctly then, if I go to Azure Repos and go to the branches, and then here if I click the ellipses next to the main branch and scroll down, I can select branch policies. Now to be SOX compliant, you need to make sure you have the four-way principle in effect. So to do that, you have to make sure you set the minimum number of reviewers. And for the four-way principle, you would need it to be at least 2. In addition to that as well, in order to get the automatic notifications, which is recommended for SOX compliancy, you should also automatically include reviewers. So for example, here, if I click on the plus sign, I can easily add Sander as a reviewer whenever a pull request is raised.
So, and these are the main points we want you to take away from this part about Azure repos. So Azure repos supports multiple version control systems like Git and TFVC. However, Git has become de facto standard nowadays for source control. And you can secure your updates using branching policies, which was demonstrated by Kevin. Git also hooks in very nice with other tools from Microsoft like Visual Studio and Azure Data Studio. Plus, if you use the Azure Data Studio Insiders build, you can use it to manage your database projects.
And as an exclusive for today's session, we're going to actually show you how this looks now. So this is Azure Data Studio Insiders build, which has been shortened a bit by some to just be called Insiders. So there's actually two versions of Azure Data Studio you can use. There's the stable release, which most people generally use. And there's this version, which is the Insiders build, which is where Microsoft tend to put in all their demo features. So how things look in the Insiders build might not necessarily be how they look when it goes out to be released in the stable version. Now, a trick I will share with you that remember the difference between the two versions if you have them installed locally. The logo for Insiders build is green, and the color green, and the logo for the stable build is blue. And that actually is also falls in line with the blue-green releases that you can use for your code. So it's a good trick to use there to remember which one is which if you have them both open. Now, if you install the Insiders build, you can then install the extension called SQL Database Projects, which you can actually see on the screen here. And I just thought for demonstration purposes, I would show you how this actually looks in Azure Data Studio Insiders build. Now from here, you can actually do some other really good things as well. You can actually build your database project the same as you do in Visual Studio. You can also publish it, or you can compare it to a database's schema. An interesting thing to note, if you do the build on here, it will automatically create the DAT pack, which gives you some interesting options. However, if you do that, one piece of advice I would recommend is to look and see which database version you have set here. Because even if you base this on a database in Azure, it can come across still set as being for SQL Server 2016 databases. So you may have to change it. So that was something we thought we would share with you for the first time ever in today's session. It's just a little added extra for you all. Anyway, moving on from there, we better discuss Azure Board Sander, since I'm going to be using it to organize our backlog items.
Good.
Now, Azure Boards can use basic, Agile, Scrum, or CMMI templates for each project that you create in Azure DevOps. Now, it's worth noting in Azure DevOps that these templates that you can create are actually called a process in Azure DevOps. So if you see anything in Azure DevOps saying that you're able to change a process, that actually means the template of whichever framework you choose. Because we're using Scrum, we'll probably want to use the Scrum template. For now, we can keep it as standard, but we can customize these templates if we need to. For example, we can add additional columns to our backlog items. So I just want to go through the standard features that you get with Azure Boards if you have it enabled for your project. So I click on Azure Boards. First of all, there's work items, which should just show you every single item you have created for your project. I should say for your area you're working in just a standard drop-down format, regardless of what type it is. Now, work items is really good if you want to look for backlog items that you've actually removed. So it's a handy trick to bear in mind if you ever have a backlog item removed by somebody, or if you want to see which items have been removed recently. And then there's boards, which by default shows the boards in a Kanban style format. And this is quite useful if you have your project set up using the Scrum template, but one of your teams wants to use something like Kanban or Scrumban, for example. And then from there are backlogs, which I'm sure anybody out there who works with Scrum will actually recognize. And this basically gives you a backlog view of all the outstanding backlog items that you have for your sprints, for example. Talking of sprints, there's actually a dedicated sprint board you can use in Azure DevOps as well. And then not only in this sprint board can you view the activity in the current sprint you're in, you can actually add new tasks to all the backlog items. And this will be very handy for Sander as well, because he can actually show this during the daily stand-ups when they go to check the progress of work during the sprint. And then last but by no means least, there are queries, which is something we're going to cover later on in this session.
Cool. So how are the backlog items organized for Scrum?
Well, if I go back to the backlog items, for example, the hierarchy here is that you have one or more epics within Scrum, and each epic can have one or more features, and each feature can have one or more backlog item, and each of those backlog items can have multiple tasks for the work. If we were to use the agile process instead, we would actually be using features and user stories.
Okay. So how do we propose we use the boards? I mean, if we just have all the backlog items in the list, it's going to be pretty cluttered, right?
Yeah, that's true. And that's why I propose that we start using tags so that we can filter on those items sensibly. And that gives us some other advantages as well.
How will we know when an item is ready to go into a sprint?
Well, we got a couple of options. We could tag the items as being refined once it's met all the criteria. And then after it's been tagged as refined, we can potentially allocate it to a sprint, which we can view on the sprint boards. Another option that we can do is set the backlog item to be in the approved state. So for example, if I go back to the boards and then click on the state, you can see there's actually an approved option here. So like I said, it entirely depends on how you want to do it within your team. By the way, everybody, the standard criteria for an item to be classed as refined in Scrum is that the item is clear and small enough to be part of the sprint. However, businesses can have their own criteria for an item is refined and ready for a sprint as well. So bear that in mind if you go from one team to another that are both using Scrum.
Sounds good, but hang on a minute though. If I've seen that we have various filters on the backlog board, but you can't show items that don't have a certain tag. How will we know what items are left to be refined?
Oh, you mean when we look here? Because of course, as you can see, there's an option for an or and an and. However, the option for a not is missing.
Yeah.
Well, we have a couple of options here. Either we can move the item straight away to a future sprint once it's refined, which means we have to make sure that we don't forget to allocate it to that sprint. Or we can use beautiful queries to show only backlog items that do not have the refined tag. Of course, everybody, they're not called beautiful queries, it's just a nickname for them. So for example, if we click on queries, you can see that there's actually a query here, which actually will show me backlog items which hasn't got the refined tag. And because me and Sander have an extension installed in Azure DevOps, I'm actually able to directly query the use the query language to refine this even better. And the language for this is called WCL. And I actually prefer using the language to doing it graphically back here, because it gives me a bit more flexibility. And that probably comes from just working with Transact SQL for so many years. By the way, on a side note, some British guy living abroad requested with Microsoft to include the not filter here. However, because there wasn't that much interest in it, Microsoft decided not to follow through with doing it, which I can fully understand.
I wonder who that could be. So anyway, talking about of sprints, how do we propose we align our Kanban method to backlog item? I mean, our items only last a couple of days, right?
Yeah, well, if they last a couple of days, it can potentially be converted to a backlog item.
Fair enough. How are we going to know what our sprint goal is, though?
Well, that's an easy one. We can actually go to the marketplace and install a Sprint Go extension, which you can view here on the Sprint board, because I'd already done it earlier. So if you click on a little shopping bag, you'll go off to the marketplace and you can install this extension.
Cool. So I'm guessing we're still going to use our other application to manage support in the meantime, or we look to do this?
Well, you can still use Azure applications to manage your boards for a while once you get used to using Azure DevOps. However, personally, I recommend ripping the Band-Aid off and doing the migration as soon as possible, though, to take advantage of all the integration you get with all the other features within Azure DevOps. By the way, Sander, did I mention all the analytics and preview features we can potentially use with this?
Steady on.
You can.
We only have 60 minutes, Kevin.
Good point. People will just have to watch our other session elsewhere to see us using Azure boards more. Anyway, the main thing to take away from this section is that Azure boards is a very powerful way of managing Scrum or Agile work visually, especially if you're a product owner.
Great. So let's talk about Azure pipelines, which is where we'll be building and deploying our deliverables.
So how would this work with SQL Server?
Well, we could look at using state-based or migration-based deployments.
Okay, so what's the difference between those two?
So state-based will deploy something entirely and check for changes, whereas migration-based will script out all the changes and deploy each change incrementally instead. And migration-based can be good, but if there's a problem, we'd have to redeploy all over again. So in our situation, I think state-based would be better for us. And it's fairly easy to build a pipeline for SQL Server update, as I will try to demonstrate right now, because I have a demo for that. So can you see my screen, Kevin?
Not yet.
Let's try it again.
Success.
Yes, there we are. So people who know me, they know that if it comes to repetitive tasks, I'm lazy as hell. And I'd rather spend a day or two programming anything to automate a process that will probably reoccur somewhere in the future. So when I had to create all these SSDT solutions for a bunch of databases, I had to go to Visual Studio, create a solution, create all the different projects in there, and then it was a lot of manual work. So what I did instead was I used the PS module development PowerShell module, which was developed by Friedrich Weinmann, and it's part of the PS framework PowerShell module. And with that previous module, development module, you can create templates of files or directory structures or anything like that. And that gave me an opportunity to create a template for my SSDT solution. So that's what I did. So I created a template called SSDT with T-SQL-T template. And what this does is it will create a solution with two projects in there, one for the data model and one for the T-SQL-T tests. And the most important piece of code in this entire script is this little line. All the other stuff is just for demo purposes, downloading the SSDT template and everything. But the only part that is really important to create the project is this little line of code. So if I run that, create my SSDT solution, takes a couple seconds. It's going to download the latest SSDT template and done. So it actually opens a screen and this is my entire solution. So if I open that, and this takes a couple seconds. Visual Studio is not that fast. I actually have a project with two different, I have a solution with two different projects, one called the unit testing data, which is the data model, and one called unit testing tests. And the unit testing part is only the name of the project I gave it. So what we can do right now is say, okay, let's create a demo database. And this script creates about 10 different tables and about 50 store procedures based on some random data. And then I can go to Visual Studio, right-click my data model, go to Import Database, and just say Export. So right-click, Import Database, select the connection, unit testing. For this purpose, I'm just going to say object type right here, say start. And now I have all my objects within my solution. And one benefit of this little project is that within the project, it also created a Azure Pipelines YAML file for you, which you can later on import in Azure DevOps. And this YAML file, this pipeline will contain a build process and a test process for both SQL 2017 and 2019. And if you later on in this session, we'll demonstrate any unit testing related stuff, and it will test these things automatically for you. I can show a little piece of code with that. And this is the entire generated pipeline, which we can import later on. All for you in there. So that's how easy it is to create these things. Back to you, Kevin.
Oh, okay then. So what about unit tests? Because I know we can do that for other programming languages within Azure DevOps, since you mentioned it just now.
Well, there's a couple ways we can do unit testing. One thing we can do is use T-SQL-T, like I mentioned, in which we use for our unit testing. And I prefer this method because it keeps the developer in a T-SQL-T bubble. They don't need to learn different languages like PowerShell or C# or anything like that. And as I mentioned before, I am lazy as hell when it comes to doing repetitive tasks. So what I wanted to do is create basic unit tests. And these basic unit tests would be something like check for the collation. Are my tables and procedures there? Do my tables have the correct data types? Do my store procedures have the correct parameters? All those kind of things. And going through all those tests manually, I figured like, hey, the only thing what's different between these tests is either a name or a little process change. And I can automate that because I can use variables. And based on that, I created a PowerShell module, which is the PST-SQL-T test generator. And what it does is it will take the current state of your database, collect all the objects, and generate tests based on those. Let me run that little script. So the only thing you have to run is invoke PSTG test generator, point to an instance, point to a database, and then where do you want to output this? And in this demo, I'm going to output it directly to my SSDT solution that I just created. So let's run that. This takes about 45 seconds, 30 seconds to 45 seconds. And it will collect all the objects. So it's going to create the object existence, function parameters, procedures, and in the end, we have about 120 something tests generated within a minute. I don't have to do all of this manually. I want to emphasize though, do not run this script every single time for your entire database, because if you do that and you push those changes into your project, it will always be successful because it's based on the current state of your database. And you only want to do this once. So now I can go in and say, okay, I can just add an existing item. Test basic. Say add. And now all my tests are in my project. So if I do any kind of deployment of this project and run a test for T-SQL-T, it will automatically get all the objects from this project because it's a dependency here. And then I can run the tests based on those objects. So that's how we can use T-SQL-T.
Yeah. Well, that's good. Do you mind if I take the screen back a minute?
Yes, go ahead.
Oh, good. Because after you just quickly showed that, I thought I would look to see how all of that actually looked once you synced it up with Azure DevOps. So, however, it didn't work first time. I clicked not to share into the screen. So there you go. So once Sander has created his projects and everything, as you saw just now, and he synced it up with Azure DevOps, this is how it would look in your Azure DevOps repository. So I also noticed, Sander, by the way, because I was looking at the pipeline your script creates and everything, which is very impressive. But I've also noticed that we can use either GUI tasks or YAML for our pipelines. Which one should we use?
Well, the GUI is good for exploring the pipelines, but in the end, YAML is easier to do. And adding new features to your YAML file is nothing more than clicking through the marketplace and setting a few values and say add. So in the end, I wouldn't use the GUI. I would just use YAML. And YAML can be easily saved in your repository.
Yeah, and I think you mentioned earlier, YAML is becoming more of the de facto standard, not just in Azure DevOps, but in other deployment tools as well. And in fact, I actually remember you showing me all of this earlier. And in fact, whilst you were explaining to everybody about T-SQL-T, I multitasked a little bit and experimented a little bit with the YAML pipeline that you'd actually created previously as well. So basically, in preparation for today's session, Sander actually uploaded his demo beforehand. And whilst he was talking, like I said, I've just been experimenting with your pipeline and extended it ever so slightly. So if we look at the pipeline, so this is the same, this was the original YAML code that you created just now as part of your script. That's been extended to deploy a bit further.
Nice.
Like I said, I had a bit of a play whilst you were just talking. And I actually created some extra stages. So this is the unit testing stage that you created earlier. And I thought to myself, can I extend it a little bit for a full deployment pipeline, your initial YAML script? And as you can see here, I can. So basically, I went off and deployed the same database into an integration environment without any of your T-SQL-T framework in it as well. So basically, you should only deploy the T-SQL-T framework to the server you're doing unit testing on. I then went from there, Sander, to a staging environment as well. And I thought, okay, well, it works for those two. How about I deploy to a third SQL instance as well to mimic production? And that worked fine. And just for everybody who's watching this, just to show there are no smoke and mirrors here, if I go to Azure Data Studio again, here are 3 separate instances of SQL Server, which I've got on Docker containers locally. And these instances could actually be anywhere on your network. So as you can see here, Sander, here's an integration version of the database you created earlier. And then on the other instance, there was a staging one. And I thought, because it went so well, I actually deployed the same copy of your database twice to the same instance, just to highlight the fact that it's very flexible and you can actually rename your databases as well as change your servers.
Nice.
Luckily, I'd already created something called an agent, which I know we're going to cover shortly as well, which helped with this a lot.
Yeah. So, of course, for SQL deployments, you can use PowerShell instead for your YAML to handle your deployments if you're dealing with a large number of servers.
How do we know if that worked?
Well, we could simply get PowerShell to output XML in the JUnit format containing the test results, and then allow Azure DevOps to use the XML in a task, which publishes the test results to view results visually. Of course, we can put other feedback mechanisms in place for deployments as well.
We can do that.
Yep.
Oh, awesome. Okay. So if I go back to Azure DevOps, and I've got another question as well relating to the pipeline. So if we go back here, for example, and I go to edit the pipeline, my question to you is, are we limited to these tasks which we saw on the screen earlier?
No, we are not. We can actually install loads of additional extensions from the marketplace and add more tasks. Of course, because we are an enterprise company, we'd have to get the request approved instead of being able to install them straight away, which you usually do, whichever team manages Azure DevOps for the whole enterprise. So,
I didn't realize that was a thing.
Oh, yeah. But it does mean we can get help with those security and compliancy issues you were talking about earlier.
Okay. Well, I've seen that we can use Microsoft hosted agents even within our own network on premises, which, by the way, is service that Microsoft hosts in Azure to do a lot of the processing of the build and release tasks, like building various artifacts and deploying them, or in our case earlier, building the DAT pack that Sander, from the code that Sander generated and deploying them to multiple instances. However, it appears that because of our infrastructure, we would have a lot of issues internally. For example, we'd have to raise a lot of firewall requests. So maybe we're better off building our own agents internally.
Yeah, maybe. But remember, a lot of us are developers. We don't want to build our own servers. Plus, we'd have to figure out what software we need to install on those agents and maintain them. What?
So, as I hope you can all see on the screen here, Microsoft actually provides guides on how to create images of their various agents on premises in GitHub. Now, I understand the title of this repo might be confusing for some of you. It actually was, until recently, called Azure Pipeline VM Images. However, because Microsoft wanted the same images to also work with GitHub Actions, they've actually rebranded the repo with all the instructions in it.
Well, we're going to do that. We might as well run the agent through the command line instead of using it as a service.
How come?
Well, everybody knows that running something through a command line gives you more detailed results, right?
Well, as you know, I tested this earlier. So let's have a look at the results in the next slide.
Behold. Yeah, not a lot of info. So, next part, test plans.
Well, they move away from that fairly quickly.
So, of course, we can do test plans once we've done the initial build and release before we release elsewhere.
Don't all these test plans have to be automated, though? Because that would take a lot of effort for some of the items.
Not necessarily. So your test plans can have multiple steps as well. As I would usually show now. However, our trial has expired, so you would just have to imagine that for now.
Yeah, so basically what Sander is explaining is that you need a slightly different license if you want to use some more advanced test plans functionality. It's just actually called Basic Plus Test Plans. You can also register for a 30-day trial of this. However, our trial has unfortunately expired, so you'll just have to imagine how they look here.
So we better discuss artifacts. This is where you can share various things like NuGet packages. For example, if you create a NuGet package, you can share it within Azure DevOps artifacts for others to use.
That's strange, because I couldn't do anything with artifacts earlier when I tested using the organization I got for free, my Visual Studio subscription.
That's because you sometimes have to go to your Visual Studio subscription benefits page to set them up.
Huh. Okay. Well, on that note as well, just a reminder for you all that if you have a Visual Studio subscription, you are eligible to have your own Azure DevOps organization to test things on. In reality, you can actually create your own organization anyway without a Visual Studio subscription. But doing so with one can bring you some additional benefits.
Just in case you want to test things without the fear of breaking your company's Azure DevOps organization. That's the whole point.
Yeah, and I use it myself, my own one as a test bed. And it also gives you an interesting insight into functionality that sometimes is just restricted on your enterprise's organization. Anyway, Sander, to be honest, there are other features I'm looking forward to the team using in Azure DevOps. For example, if we go back to it, I'm really looking forward to using all these different dashboards for things. And I think you might find this one helpful as well, being a Scrum Master for your daily stand-ups, because you can put it there in big, bold letters what the sprint goal is to remind everybody in your team every day. And of course, the usual kind of metrics that you can show as well, like your spread burn down and your velocity, etc. as well.
Don't forget the wiki.
Oh, that's true. And then there's this interesting new analytics views feature, which is currently in preview. So for the benefit of anybody that's not heard about this feature yet, basically you get a whole list of views, which you can think of conceptually a bit like views in SQL Server databases. So these views will give you an insight into various metrics within Azure boards. And what you can actually do with these views is actually use them within Power BI. And you can create very powerful Power BI dashboards for this. And in fact, I've actually used this myself and tested it to be used as part of a sprint review. That's how powerful you can use these within Power BI.
Ooh. So where shall we begin?
Well, I suggest we start by getting both teams together and explain to them what we're trying to achieve to get them all involved in the process, because it's going to can take a while.
Oh yeah. So anyway, that's what all we've got time for today. And I'm curious if there are any questions. Yeah, just go ahead. We've got all the time in the world.
It's worth noting whilst we're waiting for questions as well, we used it today for SQL Server database deployments, but in reality, use Azure DevOps for deploying other things as well. Other database management systems, for example, other data platform services in the cloud. Mostly, of course, if you use Azure services, there's extra benefits from there as well. So that you're not limited to what we showed you today within Azure DevOps by any means at all.
And the template I showed before with the generation of the SSDT solution, I am I'm adding a feature that it also contains a GitHub Actions pipeline file as well, but I'm still working on that. So you don't you can actually, in the end, just use GitHub Actions.
And I happen to know that actual companies are using Sandra's T-SQL-T deployment script as well. So it's worth looking at.
So you just have to unshare, Kevin.
I'm sorry, I've been selfish. I'm sharing the questions. So, like we said, Joy, yeah, like we said at the start of the session, this is obviously, it would usually be a long process to do if you're going to move a team to move towards a more DevOps way of working. For the benefit of today's session, we speeded it up to 60 minutes.
That is fantastic. I'm glad that we were able to see a lot of features, capabilities, how to set up, how to walk through the Azure DevOps environment. You show the board, you show actually too some brand new features, which, as you mentioned, still at the preview stage, folks. But that it's enough to provide us with an understanding of what is to come and what it look like. Very exciting. I also here have Sander showing us about the T-SQL-T. Great way to create and run many tests. So once you finish development, you do a new release, you can go put through the test instead of having to, on how can I say, on an instant, he ran through PowerShell that test. So really like it.
Yeah. Like I said, I happen to know that companies are using that as well.
And if people are starting to use the T-SQL test generator, and you figure out some other tests that you're missing, please let me know, because if you are missing it, probably someone else is missing it, so I can just add it.
Awesome, very well. Let me double check again if there's any other questions here. Not at this point. It looks good.
Cool.
All right, folks. Anything else you'd like to add here as we come to the conclusion of this very awesome and meaning you all took the time, walk us through the Azure DevOps environment. We saw the PowerShell script, we saw the T-SQL tests, and how it can be used. I believe that Kevin also mentioned about it's not only for SQL Server, but it can also be used for other databases. Did I hear that correctly?
This can be used for other databases, for code servers. The possibilities are very large if you're using Azure DevOps, which is why a lot of enterprises are starting to use it at scale.
All right, and what's funny there when I saw you all showing is not even before TFS, the other two, source safe, I believe you showed there, right?
Oh yeah.
That was a crack.
I actually used that in the past, and I that's why I have such I lost all my hair at that point. Like,
all right.
There's a reason why Microsoft stopped developing their product.
But it's good that, as you mentioned, they have evolved, they have a good solid product that is, with Azure DevOps that is going, and you see the integration with Git as well makes it very smooth. In addition to depending the environment one is using, whether it's Visual Studio, even Visual Studio Code, you have extensions that you can integrate to it, and plug into Git. Very cool.
You can do it in Azure Data Studio now as well, straight into Git.
Yeah,
really
make it.
useful.
Sorry, go ahead.
You can do it in Azure Data Studio now as well. There's an extension, and you can connect directly to your Git repositories in Azure Data Studio. It's really powerful.
Yes, and brings more to that unified environment where you can use so many different tools. I was talking about Visual Studio. You just outline Azure Data Studios there, so they can all come together. Regardless of the tool the developer team is using.
Yeah.
Yep.
Anything that can be changed, the code can be put in those repositories by what tool of your choice.
Awesome. All right, gentlemen. Anything else you'd like to add and share with us here?
I am good.
Yes, same for me as well. I'm good. If nobody else has got any other questions.
No, we don't. We're all cool here. I once again, on behalf of the Microsoft Data and AI South Florida user group, we really appreciate both of you taking all the time to prepare and deliver this great presentation. Also to our members and viewers on YouTube, thank you very much. And I would like to remind you all viewers to remember, click the like button, drop a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you, Kevin. Thank you, Sander.
Thank you for having us.
Bye-bye.
All right. See you
Thanks,
all,
everybody.
folks.